good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for uh, braving the rather hot and inclement weather to come and spend this evening with us. Um, Obviously, there is a great deal of interest and concern about the forthcoming visit of Prime Minister Modi to China. There is no doubt that this will be a major political event in the relationship between the two countries. It will also have a certain impact in terms of the region, as well as Asia Pacific, generally speaking. And therefore, there is a great deal of interest not only in India but abroad as well as to how this visit is going to play itself out. And I'm very happy to have with me to have a sort of an informal conversation amongst ourselves. We have Srinath Raghavan, again, needs no introduction. He is with the Center for Policy Research, has done yeoman's work in terms of looking at researching the India-Pakistan relationship. He has gone through somewhat dusty archives to really give us a picture of how things have evolved during major periods of our recent political history. And we also have Mr. Sridhar Venkateshwaran, who will be talking to us about the economic dimension of the relationship between India and China. So just to set the stage so that my co-panelists can really take up some of these key issues. If you ask me what is the challenge which we face with respect to China today, I think the perhaps overriding kind of a perception that comes before us is the growing asymmetry between our two countries. Growing asymmetry in terms of both the economic capabilities of the two countries as well as their security capabilities. Not only is that asymmetry quite large at the moment, but it's asymmetry which seems to be even expanding as we go forward. And there is no doubt that if there is that asymmetry, it imposes certain constraints. Whether we admit it or not, it does impose certain constraints in the manner in which we manage the China relationship. So one is the issue of what do we do in order to deal with this current asymmetry, but there is also the larger question, a longer term question. How do we overcome this asymmetry? Do we want to overcome this asymmetry? And what is the kind of trajectory that we have to spell out for ourselves, chart out for ourselves in terms of dealing with this asymmetry in the longer term? Because I'm also convinced that if there is one country which has the potential not only to become a country which is in the same league as China, but even perhaps to overtake it, it is perhaps only India, both in terms of its size, its population, in terms of the capabilities that it has, in terms of the resources that it has. This is one country, if you're looking around you, which is the country which has the capacity for that countervailing power. To my mind, it is only India. Now, this should not seem to you as if one is looking at the relationship only as if it has only negative dimensions. There are, of course, positive dimensions in the relationship as well. Conflict between India and China is not inevitable. In fact, if you look at the record of the last 30 or more years, what is remarkable is that despite the differences that the two countries have, they have been actually quite successful in managing this relationship. The Prime Minister of India pointed out recently, I think in the interview to Time magazine, that for the last so many years, perhaps since 1975, not a single shot has been fired in anger across the border. And that's something that perhaps we need to express satisfaction over, that the two countries have displayed a degree of maturity in actually managing the relationship. There are also opportunities in the relationship. Opportunities because despite their differences, India and China as emerging countries have a certain common interest in adjusting existing global regimes. whether it is in terms of trade or whether it is in terms of, you know, climate change issue or new areas like cybersecurity. There are a whole host of areas where, in terms of tweaking existing regimes, reshaping existing regimes so that they are more aligned with our interests, in terms of working together to ensure that new regimes which are emerging, these also have, or these are also shaped by countries like India and China as much as they are by existing major powers. So there is a certain common interest between the two countries. In terms of the bilateral relationship, there is no doubt that at a time when India is really looking for a major push in terms of its infrastructure, investment, trade, China suggests itself as a very, very significant partner. I think the issue that really is not that we do not engage in that economic and trade relationship or investment relationship with China, but we have to be mindful of the fact that the more dense the economic relationship becomes, separating it or abstracting it from the overall political relationship is not going to be possible. Sooner or later, you know, the misalignment between these two will actually have to be dealt with. But having said that, there is really no reason why we should not explore those economic opportunities. So this is the sort of setting against which I see the very important visit taking place. But to deal with some of the issues that I have raised, perhaps Srinath, you could now tell us something about your perspective on how you think this very important political and security relationship will involve, and what will be the impact of this very important visit taking place. Yes. You have the floor.
Thank you, sir. I mean, you've sort of put out the wider landscape very nicely, which makes my job quite easy. What I want to do is, you know, in the next few minutes, really focus on political security issues, with the caveat that economic issues, as you pointed out, already are quite deeply enmeshed with these. So, you know, there is no sort of complete silos or bubbles under which these issues are being considered. But nevertheless, you know, just for the sake of focusing on issues, I'll talk about political security issues. And here, what I want to do really is to talk about these at sort of three levels or layers, whichever you want to think about it. One of them is of course, the straightforward bilateral questions that we have to deal with in terms of China. The second are, you know, regional issues, and the third are sort of what you might call extra-regional or wider sort of questions which come into play. And then what I want to also talk about a little bit is how these levels might interact with one another and what is it that we need to be mindful of. So in terms of bilateral security relations, I think the good news is what Mr. Shamsaran has said, which is that, you know, we have a disputed boundary which has nevertheless been quite calm and stable for a very long period of time. And, you know, we all get, you know, periodically worked up about Chinese incursions and so on. But the fact is that when you, say, juxtapose the line of actual control with China, say, with the line of control with Pakistan, it automatically becomes clear what a grave, you know, it's a completely different world. I've served as an army officer on both sides, and it's completely different. So you know, that aspect of it has to be recognized. And what we also have to understand is that, you know, that was not a given. There was no automatic logic at work that, you know, the boundary should have been stable for so long. It is because political and diplomatic energies were invested over a period of time to make sure that this stability is maintained. From time to time, we've sort of upgraded the kinds of mechanisms that we've had in place in order to deal with newer challenges that have come up. And it now seems to me that we are at a point where maybe some of the older arrangements at place are not really sort of capable of dealing with some of the newer developments that we've seen. What we are seeing now is really a break from the traditional Chinese pattern. You know, we see more often the Chinese sort of coming in, you know, pitching up tents, staying on location, you know, making it a more long drawn out process which cannot be dealt simply by way of sort of border flag meetings and so on. And, you know, there are at least two reasons to my mind why this seems to be happening. One is that, you know, the Chinese in the period up to, say, 2000 to 2003 have done enormous development of their infrastructure in Tibet. The Indians are belatedly trying to catch up with it, and obviously the Chinese have an interest in trying to prevent India from doing it, right? So whichever parts where of the line of actual control where the Chinese have difficulty in accessing, where we have slightly better tactical advantage, are the places where these flashpoints are occurring. So there is clearly a tactical, on-the-ground jockeying which is happening, which is not going to stop anytime soon. And it's happening simply because India is actually, believe it or not, slowly getting its act together. So that is a dimension that is not going to go away anytime soon. It is not in India's interest to stop any of these activities because we have to ensure that our logistic support capabilities up to the line of actual control are improved periodically. The second thing, of course, is that these also are ways in which a certain degree of strategic pressure and signaling is done from the Chinese side from time to time. We saw that happening when the Chinese president was here. And at those points, there is a lot of debate within India about whether the PLA is operating autonomously, etc. I think the balance of informed opinion is that that is not the case, that these things are fairly carefully thought through, and that we are not seeing a PLA which is sort of operating according to its own conceptions of what need to be done. So clearly there are these kinds of problematic issues which are departures from the past, for which we will need slightly higher levels of mechanisms to work through. And I think that will be one of the things the Prime Minister will be certainly taking it up, and maybe there are already things under the works there. The second thing which the Prime Minister sort of mentioned when President Xi Jinping was here the last time was about resumption of talks for clarification of the line of actual control. Now, I think the government has got a sort of a slightly limited objective in mind here, which is to say that let's identify a set of areas which are recurrently problematic and try and see if we can clarify our conception. Now, as a historian, I'm kind of skeptical because the past track record of Chinese on this particular question has been that they are very resistant to it. They are resistant because they believe that any exercise at LAC clarification will more or less make a boundary de facto, which is something that they don't want to do, right? So LAC clarification is something that I think we will push for, but even if the Chinese accept, I don't think that there is going to be much by way of this thing. So the best that we can hope for in terms of boundary stabilization may be better sort of enhanced, confidence building measures and a political agreement that, keeping this state of, relative tranquility in place is in both sides of strategic interest. I think that is what we need to work towards. Now, in terms of what are the sorts of, regional questions at work. Now, the main regional question from India's point of view, of course, is the China-Pakistan relationship. What we have seen in the recent past is a sort of not a spurt in terms of what China is doing for Pakistan, but as much as their willingness to now stand up and say that they're actually doing these things. Like, for instance, there was this announcement of the number of sort of nuclear power plants which are being coming up, of the kinds of things that they want to do, nuclear submarines for Pakistan, and so on. Now, that again shows that the Chinese are want to make a statement that yes, this is a very important relationship for us, and that they are not going to give in to other parties' concerns, particularly Indian concerns. Now, the question of terrorism is one where I think the Chinese also have certain issues as far as Pakistan is concerned, linked to groups in Xinjiang. But as Ambassador Shamsaran keeps telling us from time to time, that's an issue where the Pakistanis have also been quite responsive to Chinese concerns. So, again, I don't see any major departure from that. So in a sense, the China-Pakistan relationship is not just progressing in the lines in which it has developed in the past, but in some ways the Chinese are being much more open, forthright about what that relationship is and what it means for them, which is something that we have to learn to deal with. At the same time, I think from a security perspective, all the things that the Chinese are doing in Pakistan, especially we say with Gwadar, if it becomes a naval facility at some point, is obviously, will have to force us to reconsider our overall security conception for the region. But at the same time, I don't think we need to take too much of an alarmist view of what is happening there. Because if the Chinese want to sort of actually develop a military presence in India's peripheries, which is not at this, I would concede, is not a given at this point of time. If they do want to do it, the corollary to that is also that the Chinese will be overextending themselves in certain ways that are advantageous to India, right? So every big infrastructure, every naval base is also a target. So from a security planner's perspective, there are challenges as well as opportunities here. So I'd say that we have to take a slightly balanced view. What is interesting in the region, of course, is the Chinese stance on Afghanistan, which has become a lot more active. They have sort of reached out to the Taliban and they've said that they're willing to sort of facilitate a process. Part of this is actually driven by US policy, because the American view is that, if the Chinese want to sort of, take control of this process in Afghanistan, they can be their guest. The Americans want to sort of get out. But from the Indian point of view, obviously, this has both positives and negatives. It is, the problematic areas are that this is also happening at a time when we have an Afghan government which is trying to make a departure from what the previous government's policy towards India was, and let's face it, that is happening. Whether they will rethink their approach a couple of years down the line or not is a second order question. But at this point of time, the fact is that you have a government in Afghanistan which believes that improving relations with Pakistan is of the first importance. And in order to do it, they rely on the United States and China to sort of facilitate that. So this is something that, obviously we need to take cognizance of because it will have implications for what we are doing. But at the same time, let's also not forget that the Chinese have been willing to talk to India about Afghanistan for at least the last 3 years. There is a dialogue which was initiated at the Chinese's behest on this question. And there are some good reasons why the Chinese will at least want to probe what India's willingness towards their orchestration of a settlement is. I mean, to put it very crudely, right, I mean, one of the main Chinese economic interests in Afghanistan is with the mineral deposits and so on. Now, if any of that is going to sort of be sent up towards the western portions of China, Xinjiang and other places, whose development is now on China's sort of strategic priority, then it will have to go through areas which are currently controlled not by the allies of Pakistan, but actually by groups which are closer to India, the old Northern Alliance groups, right? So in a sense, there India might have a role to play, provided we can sort of revive some of those ties. Again, it depends on what degree of diplomatic and strategic nimbleness we show on this question. Finally, on this sort of broader extra-regional questions, I think on the Indian Ocean region, the current government has gone further than the previous government in stating their willingness to work with the United States and other powers to ensure that the maritime sort of stability of the region is maintained. There was a joint statement which was given when President Obama was here. At the same time, I believe an agreement is in the cards about sort of cooperation on maritime issues with the Chinese, which is likely to be announced when this goes. Now, here is an area which I think has both, the kind of short-term and longer-term dimensions that Ambassador Shamsaran was alluding to. The short-term issues being that, we do have the advantage at this point of time, which is that China's ability to project power in the Indian Ocean is as of date, considerably limited, partly because of the various other issues into which it's enmeshed in the East and South China Seas. But that will change over a period of time, and the Chinese are acquiring various kinds of platforms to make sure that that change happens over a period of time. So what we do have is a reasonably limited window of time within which, A, to build up our own capabilities, to get into operational arrangements with other countries to make sure that we are capable of working with everyone else in the region, apart from the United States, to make sure that our interests are preserved. But at the same time, we should understand that this is not going to be cost-free. In a sense, the Chinese are not going to simply sit aside and look at us while we are going around doing these things. They will try and up the ante elsewhere, and we just have to be prepared for those things. Finally, on the sort of multilateral issues, I actually believe that in the current context, those issues are in some ways actually quite central to India's thing. And here I think particularly of issues around the sort of reordering of the trade, overall sort of thing which is happening. And that is happening at the behest of the United States and its allies, right? Which is to say that, the mega regional trade pacts like Trans-Pacific Partnership, Transatlantic, investment with the EU, which is happening, is basically an attempt to rewrite much of the existing rules of the game. And let's face it, the countries who have benefited most from the current rules are actually China and India. The country which will have biggest problems when these rules, if at all they are imported to the global agenda, will actually be India, because China is in some ways even better positioned than us to sort of adapt to those rules. And so it therefore becomes very important for us to have a clear strategy, A, about what is it that we want to do on the WTO front, what is it that we are doing with China on the RCEP, and how does that tie up with, because the Chinese are today saying that they can consider TPP, and that will be a reality. And this has very real implications, right? If the government is, and the Prime Minister has repeatedly said that Make in India is a priority, we want to transform India into a manufacturing hub, then you're talking about doing all of this in an international trading context where there'll be a new range of non-tariff barriers which will come in as new standards are being imported onto the trade agenda because of these things, right? So which means your market access is going to get considerably difficult if these things do go through. So this is not something which, as I see it, is sort of peripheral issue. It's not a multilateral issue, typically which you can sort of put on the margins. It's central to the domestic agenda of the government. So I think, working this through, again, here I think there is an opportunity to work with the Chinese, but let's also bear in mind the Chinese can move much faster than we can, sure, like they have with climate change and other issues. I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you very much, Srinath, for spelling out some of the kind of bilateral and regional issues that we would be confronting. To set the stage for your remarks, Sridhar, What I wanted to particularly take up on was what was said by Srinath towards the end of his remarks, that if we are looking at the international trading and economic order, we see that perhaps temporarily, I don't know, I believe that it's a longer term trend. The kind of phase of globalization that we had with a very liberal and open trading order, that seems to have, in a sense, it seems to be in a phase of reversal. We see a certain fragmentation of the global economy taking place. You have the TPP and you have the TTIP, which are in the works. And these are essentially going to create islands of advanced economies, which will confront countries like ourselves with, as he said, a number of non-tariff barriers in the form of gold standard norms or gold standard specifications for goods. Also, in terms of the regime for things like intellectual property, or if we are talking about health standards, environment standards, labor standards, all these seem to be designed to actually, sort of put up walls. It may be that China is currently the economic or trading threat, but the impact is, as he said, much more on us than it is on China. And China has, at a certain point of time, the ability, because of its weight in the in global trade, and now with regard to investment as well. I mean, look at the success of the AIIB, for example. It has far more negotiating clout to work out a deal with, say, TPP than perhaps India would be able to do. So it is in that context where, if we are looking at what I mentioned, overcoming the asymmetry between the two sides over a period of time, if India were to try and follow the same trajectory as China had over the last 30 years, I'm afraid I don't think this is going to be a very successful strategy, even with the kind of opportunities that we can exploit in our trading and economic relationship with China. So how should we approach this particular challenge?
Thanks, Ambassador. Let me start off by first contextualizing this asymmetry. On the security and political side, you've had, if I were to call it, a relative calmness, though the asymmetry is very visible. On the trade side, it's actually the opposite. The trade has been growing at a dramatic pace, widening the asymmetry. So in 13-14, we had a trade deficit of 35 billion. I believe once the 14-15 numbers come out, we would have crossed 40 billion. So it's a one-way street as far as China is concerned. If I take the post-financial crisis period, 2009 to 2014, India's position in the global trading partners of China has improved. We were the second fastest growing market for Chinese goods into India after Vietnam. And both of us have conflict situations with China. So, if you look at the history of China, whether it's Japan or Korea, some of their largest trading partners, they've always had conflict issues. And they have, in a way, learned to deal with that at one level and learned to let business carry on at another level. There have also been some other dimensional changes which have happened since 2009. Actually, before I touch upon that, let me add that this whole market opportunity that India has given to China has not been one of China's making. It has been actually the Indian entrepreneurship which has allowed the Chinese companies to come and take this market in India. India, being an open market, there are various interest groups which have, in the context of the kind of investment which is taking place, gone out globally.
Power and telecom.
Power, telecom, there's now the latest electronics, mobile phones. We have had at various points in time different product groups, I mean, you see the power and telecom are well known, but if you take chemicals, if you take consumer goods, I mean, which are unknown, where there are plenty of small traders, and if you take the flights between India and China, you can see that happening. It's Indian entrepreneurs and traders who are going to different regions and picking up products and bringing them here. And all this during a period where India has been one of the most active leviers of anti-dumping duty on Chinese products. So we have levied the most anti-dumping duties in the world against China. That hasn't stopped this trade deficit from growing the way it has been. And the fact of the matter is that Indian entrepreneurs have zeroed in on the most, if I were to call it, competitive base from which they could source and brought those products in from China. At the next level, moment they saw such a responsive, if I were to call it, customer, and people who have dealt with Chinese businesses, they are the most powerful sales guys. They will go after business, tooth and nail, saying, okay, this is an opportunity, I will grab it at all costs. So it's been kind of a good marriage, if I were to say, a willing customer and a more than responsive supplier has caused this whole trade balance to emerge. Now, we are at an interesting pass in 2015, where if I compare back to 2009, we have done some very detailed cost economic comparison of what were the cost structures in China in 2009, what are the cost structures today in China, and how have they changed between India and China. And what we are seeing is the relative competitiveness has changed pretty significantly since 2009. The pace at which some of the earlier commodities were being imported, for example, Tatas and Mahindras used to import massive amounts of auto components from China. Today they are no longer doing it because the dynamics have changed. India is actually more competitive in many of these products than importing from China. Hero MotoCorp, the largest suppliers of two-wheeler wheels, alloy wheels, was a Chinese company. Today the Chinese company has come and set up a plant in Manesar to retain that market. The currency difference between India and China relative to the US dollar has changed almost 30% since 2009. The Indian rupee has moved in one direction. China, given its economic priorities, given the fact that they want to present an alternative to the US dollar, to the US economy, are keeping their currency far more steady. They have the wherewithal of, if I were to call it, an opaque financial sector to, and tons of foreign exchange reserve to project a certain currency, which in real, if you were to take the RER terms, does not really reflect what it's trading at today. Now, so if I were to call it, India is in a fortunate position where, given the economic priorities of China, the relative competitive position between India and China is changing, will continue to change. My prediction is that by December, you will see this even more enhanced if US raises the interest rates sometime in the course of the second half of this year. Now, what does this present to us? We have always said that India has certain advantages in certain sectors over China. Whether, the most popular one which comes to mind is pharmaceuticals. And anybody who's traveled around in China, who goes out, and if you're unfortunate to fall ill, you go and buy medicines, you are shocked by the relative prices of the same medicine, a similar composition of a generic product in China versus India. It's very common to find these prices to be 3 to 4 times the price of India. Now, we have never been able to access the Chinese market. Ranbaxy, some of our top generic companies have gone, set up plants over there, tried to break into the market, we have never succeeded. So these market access issues are not, if I were to call it, new. We have been saying that Indian IT industry, Indian pharma industry, some of Indian, if I were to call it, intra-industry niches. Let me give you another example, turbines. Now, the conventional logic is that China is very good supplying a lot of turbines to us for our power sector. But if you were to look at hydroelectric turbines, which are in the sub 60 category range, 60 megawatt range, India is actually the most competitive player in the world. GE has come and formed a joint venture with an Indian company to supply to the global markets. But we have never again had access to the Chinese market in that category. So to come back to your point, the whole market access issue as far as China is concerned is far more relevant today, given where we are as far as the asymmetry is concerned, and given the relative position of India vis-a-vis China in many of these sectors. Now, China has also changed its priorities. China is very clearly saying, in the next 5 years, I need to control the growth of my healthcare costs. I need to make the Chinese economy more domestic focused. Having said that, just as the day when India launched its Made in India campaign, China launched a Made in China campaign, or Make in China campaign, where their emphasis is, don't make commodity stuff in China, come and make the most sophisticated manufacturing products in China. One of the largest contract manufacturers for electronic products in China, Foxconn, has a plan to bring 1 million robots into their manufacturing ecosystem in China over the next 3 years. So, for all the face that it puts, it's one of the most capitalist in its outlook as far as business is concerned, and that's how you would characterize China. Now, given this context, we feel that there is actually going to be momentum in the reverse direction. If we are allowed, and if we present our case in a certain manner, that China actually sees it as a win-win. In the last 6 months, if you follow the Chinese media, there have been 3 or 4 cases of Chinese citizens being arrested for smuggling drugs from India. Now, all this, and there's been an uproar in the social media when the arrest happened, because the idea is that they are actually helping the Chinese economy. So, it's my view that we are at an opportune time where, given the relative importance that India is, as far as China is concerned, as a market, to push for market access in some targeted sectors and actually see a reversal of the whole market opportunity. So, India today is exporting commodities. You will see exports of value-added products happening from India if certain types of market access issues are allowed in China. Now, we have been asking for this market access for a number of years, but given the context of where we are, given the relative positions of the currency, given the priorities of China, we think the ability to get market access in China is the most favorable, and it will increase as we go along down the line. The second key dimension is while we cannot use exports as a way to bridge this asymmetry between India and China, we need to strategically use investment also from China to India. Now, some of this investment flow, again, given the open market system in India, will automatically happen. So, don't be surprised if in 2 to 3 years' time, whether you take a Xiaomi or a Gionee and they start making some of these mobile phones that they are today marketing so heavily in India, automatically coming and making in India. But you're going to see, more importantly, if India were to get its act together, to see how to take sectors where China is going to lose competitiveness in the context of global trade, and can we attract the Taiwanese or the Korean or other Asian investors or even Western investors to look at selectively, and that's why I agree with you that it cannot be following blindly what China has done as far as the manufacturing-led export strategy is concerned, but selectively trying to see which are the sectors where we think we can play a role and attract them, and also serve it back not just to the Chinese market, but also to the international markets. China has a stated policy that they want to have 5 to 6 global brands. A little earlier, late last year, we took a delegation of about 20 auto component companies to 3 OEMs in China. Great Wall, which is their largest SUV manufacturer, Photon, which is their largest truck manufacturer. Both of them are very clear that they want to be a global brand in 5 years. And again, there is a fair bit of government push to make them move in that direction. And they are very open today in their approach to say, we will buy from wherever it makes sense. We are no longer going to be sourcing only from China or encouraging Chinese companies to make in China to supply to us. We are encouraging our ecosystem to go outside China, invest where required, and India is at a fortunate position to actually leverage some of our capabilities in certain sectors. Auto components being one of them, the light engineering being another, and so on. So to come back to your larger question, in my view, while the trade pacts, whether you take the TPP or the RCP, will influence the way global trade moves, and the rise of non-tariff barriers will potentially increase. I think there is a certain momentum between the India-China economic relationships, which I think may not be as impacted in a bilateral sense. It may impact other areas which may prevent access for India to certain other markets rather than really China. China is an own animal by itself in terms of allowing us market access, and we need to deal with them bilaterally rather than through a multilateral trade regime.
Well, I certainly hope you are right, but let me just mention to you that if one looks at the recent trends in China, despite the fact that for several years, as you know, Chinese leaders have been talking about how it is very important to rebalance the strategy of development in China from what is an investment and export-led growth strategy to one which is more focused on domestic consumption. Frankly, that shift has not taken place. In fact, if you look at recent figures, whereas the share of consumption in overall GDP has been about 38, 39% a few years ago, it has actually declined to something like 36%. This is despite the fact that retail sales in China have been increasing at the rate of about 12% per annum. What does this mean? It means that the proportion of investment is still very large. So, number one, I mean, if we are looking at how large is this market which we can access, I am afraid at a time when our traditional markets are getting closed or are weak, this is not the market which seems to offer a very large opportunity for India, because of the fact that the structure of that economy is still very much focused on investment rather than on consumption. And secondly, I think also a very important aspect, if you look at recent figures again of the import intensity of China's consumption expenditure, import intensity is only 2%. Which means that even if consumption is increasing, the import intensity or the willingness to import from outside to meet that consumption demand, in fact, is rather small. So, while I take your point that there are opportunities and we should be pushing for those areas where we have some competitive strength, the record so far has actually not been very encouraging.
Absolutely.
Whether it is pharmaceuticals, whether it is IT, in many cases we find that there is IT is a classic example, an earlier period of a much more liberal approach, inviting Indian IT companies to come. A lot of them were trained in India. Infosys campus, you had sometimes 1,000 Chinese software programmers being trained. Once that reached a certain critical mass, no further development in the relationship. So I'm a bit skeptical about that economic aspect, that when we are talking about China as a huge economic opportunity, a certain degree of caution is called for. And of course, I agree with you that it is Indian business which has, in a sense, opened out the market to Chinese products, what I call the EVU syndrome.
Correct.
I mean, you know, there's this market in northern China where you will find large numbers of Indian traders who go there and buy plastic Ganeshas and Chinese silk saris which they bring to India because it's so cheap. But I think these are the sort of realities that we have to contend with, that at a time when our traditional markets are in fact becoming more and more, relatively speaking, more and more closed, we do not necessarily have a equivalent opportunity opening up for us as far as the Chinese market is concerned. So I still believe that we have to somehow rethink our strategy in terms of how do we take the Indian growth story forward. If you are looking at double-digit growth for the next 20 years, 30 years like China, repeating the Chinese story will not be the answer. That's what I feel.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. I think the context with which I was talking about all of these opportunities was not to put it in as an alternative to other markets. Yeah. But all we are saying is if you were to look back and say, if our ability to compete in the Chinese market was, we have a certain track record, the relative economic positions of the two countries has changed pretty substantially. And I fully agree with you that if you look at the macroeconomics numbers, Chinese economy structure has not changed very dramatically. But if you go down to the micro details, there is a lot more interest from, just as we are seeing, I'm putting the exact opposite of what happened in India from 2008-9. There's a lot more interest from Chinese entrepreneurs to come and see what can they do with India.
Sure.
And so what you will see is a reversal of some sort. Now, whether this will result in a $30 billion trade between India and China, India exporting that kind of quantum, or will it be $4-5 billion, is a little too early to say. All we are saying is in some of these, in the pharma sector, for example, the work that we have done shows that there are about 50 odd molecules which are generics in the context of the globe, which are not produced in China. What is being used is the imported patented product offered by the Western companies. The difference in price for those 50 products between the patented product in China and the generic product in India is some 9.5 or 10 times. So if you were to not talk about it in the global context and say, okay, these are 50 products that if I were to tell you that give us market access, you come and source from India, let the Chinese brands take it. You're not trying to disturb the problem that India has is that if we go and try and compete with Chinese pharma companies in the Chinese market, given the plethora of registrations that you need to do, we can never compete, which is the reason Ranbaxy had to shut down and Dr. Reddy's is struggling. But if you were to change the whole dimension and say, okay, India is very good at making in India and exporting, which is what we are doing for the rest of the world, why not look at it in that context for China in a targeted manner?
Okay, so a more granular approach, looking at niche areas where we can perhaps move forward, not to expect really big time, big bang kind of. Okay, I take.
But even those niches, Ambassador Saran, is that even those niches, given the size of the Chinese market, can move the needle in terms of our current trade with China and where it can be.
Yeah.
We export less than 50 million to China. Getting these niches of 50 products could take it to 3 billion, which is still a very small proportion of the $70 billion Chinese market. So where we are coming from is we cannot hope to engage with China at a macro level. On the economic side, the only battles we can win are micro battles, doing a lot of homework, saying that, look, this is the benefit that you're getting and therefore allow market access.
Okay.
We don't have the clout of a Germany or a US, which is the way they dealt with their trade deficit issues was very different. We don't have that kind of position to really deal with it. Maybe in 3-4 years, if India is the second largest market for China, maybe we'll have the clout to force them to come and do buying missions here or something of that nature.
Yeah, well, I suppose we have not really been able to leverage the scale of our market as a bargaining chip.
Exactly.
I think that's something which is repeatedly one finds that we are not really.
And I don't know how well we can really do it, because given the disparate nature of the way in which the Indian thing changes.
Certainly, but I think one should make an effort to do that, because after all, what else do you have? I mean, each country tries to see what is its area of strength, and I think an area of strength for India is precisely the scale of the market it is able to offer in virtually every important product.
And probably the first glimmers of that are emerging, where for example, in LED lights, and I'm sure all of you are buying LED lights. Many of them are made in China. Some of the large government tenders which have come out have very clearly specified you need to get it approved by BIS. So which is in some sense a market access barrier to prevent the Chinese product from coming in.
Sure, sure. Thank you very much. I mean, I think that gives us a much better understanding of what the economic and trade challenges are dealing with China. Srinath, to come back to you on some of the issues, you spoke about, of course, the relationship between China and Pakistan. There is a sense that, while for quite some time the China-Pakistan relationship was very India-specific, and many of the things that we found China doing with Pakistan was very much related, for want of a better word, to really, in a sense, contain India within the subcontinent. What we have seen in the last visit of Xi Jinping to Pakistan appears to have actually gone beyond the bilateral dimension, because I mean, the Chinese themselves have been saying that, for example, with respect to the One Belt, One Road initiative, Pakistan is very critical, because this is where the belt and the road actually meet. I mean, if you look at Gadar, it is a stop on the maritime Silk route, but it is also the terminal for the, or at least one terminal of the land route. And that this, in terms of China's broader global ambitions, whether it is in respect of much larger presence in the Middle East and the Gulf area, its a view of what its position is with respect to Central Asia, also in terms of what terrorism that you spoke about, the importance of this having become a major preoccupation of the Chinese. I mean, these are factors which have become far more salient. They may have been present before, but they seem to have become far more salient, especially with this visit, than what we have seen in the past. Any thoughts about that? Is this something that we should look at? Is this something which has, additional implications for us?
I mean, with the Pakistan thing, I definitely think the way in which, as you're saying, Gwadar is going to be now part of, the belt and the route, will have significant implications for us, and which is why I think the government's announcement that they're actually now going to go ahead with the Chabahar port in Iran is quite significant, and it's long overdue. It's taken us a very long time to do. But the other thing, of course, is that the various sorts of things that the Chinese are doing in our periphery. The one thing we can be sure of is that much of that will actually come off. The Chinese have extraordinary sort of delivery capabilities for these kinds of large infrastructure projects, and come with very good levels of sort of very lucrative financing and other things. So in a sense, this is a reality that we have to learn to live with. So one option can be that we decide that we sort of plug into certain aspects of it, which is what we've done now, and try and stay away from others. My own view is that it might be better to sort of be in the tent and shape things in a way that is not sort of impinging upon us. Because at the end of the day, the simple fact is that our ability to sort of compete with China on this terrain is very, very limited, and that is not going to get better anytime soon. So in a sense, my own view is that, on the one hand, we have to do things like, Chabahar with Iran, develop our political relations within our time when maybe the Iranians are coming out, back into the international mainstream after a very long time. And even in our own neighborhood, which is that, we be part of some of these initiatives, but with the view that we will also shape the way that things are happening in our periphery, rather than saying that, we'll stay out, let the Chinese do what they want. I think that might not be the best approach, is my view.
Yeah, so how do you make a choice? What do you participate in, what you do not participate in? I mean, that's a very difficult judgment call.
But the fact is that, already a lot of things that we're doing, say for instance in Myanmar, right? I mean, most of the gas that we are exploring in Myanmar is actually going to China already. I mean, it's not as if any of that stuff is coming to us, because our, infrastructure attempts with Myanmar have not really taken off in the way that they should have. So that is the reality that we are already living with. So in a sense, it does not seem to me, therefore, that we should try and keep away from these projects, because those things are going to reshape the periphery in very, very significant ways. And if we are part of those attempts, at least, there are ways in which we can exercise pressure points, which we will not be able to do if we stay out. And, it's a classic, like what the Americans have done with the AIIB, right? They tried to stay out, but the fact is that those things are going ahead. And at some point, you have to catch up with reality that this is happening. So, so I think the sooner we wake up and understand that, the Chinese are very serious about this thing, it comes not just because of their strategic perspective, but because of the way the Chinese economy is developing now. There's too much of spare capacity in engineering, in railways. I mean, just yesterday the Chinese have announced a huge trans-Andes railways in Latin America. They are doing these long, huge rail projects in Southeast Asia with Indonesia and other countries. So these things are going to happen, and they're happening partly because of Chinese sort of economic realities and partly because of strategic realities. And we have to see what is it that we need to guard against. Things like what's happening in Gwadar, we need to have other kinds of pressure points. But by and large, I think it's better for us to be part of those things and try and shape them rather than staying out.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to take up that issue, my experience in Myanmar or, for example, in Nepal, frankly speaking, we have far more assets in terms of levers of influence than, in fact, the Chinese have in virtually each one of the neighboring countries. I think where we have, and therefore, I would say that if you, as I say, if you create spaces, somebody is going to walk in. I mean, much of the challenge is not so much how do I keep China out or how do I keep other countries out. This is my backyard. But in terms of what I can do, actually not to allow those spaces to be created. Because if you really leverage all the assets that you have, say with a country like Nepal, frankly speaking, even if there is a presence of China or other countries, it need not be something that you need to be concerned about. So it's not so much how do I put the other influence down, but how do I raise my presence, my engagement to a higher level? I mean, that has to be, in a sense, the game that you have to play. I mean, it's no longer an issue of how I can keep others out.
Absolutely.
And this is where I think perhaps in all the debate about, Chinese influence is increasing, they are doing many more projects, and their presence has increased. I think we are missing the point that really the focus has to be not so much on looking at what others are doing, but really looking at what we are able to do. And in this respect, I still believe that this government, which has shown a tremendous amount of vigor and energy in pursuing, engagement and cooperation with our neighboring countries, that one issue of the lack of capacity, lack of delivery, this is something which is going to be a perennial problem in terms of, how do we deal with this challenge. And I think this is something that I very strongly believe. I mean, again, my experience with both Myanmar as well as with Nepal has been that at a time when we have been able to get our act together and have been able to actually raise the level of our engagement with these countries across the board. And by the way, most of these countries welcome a much higher level of engagement with India. And I think it's a matter of regret that somehow we have not been able to respond to that with very prompt delivery on our side. So that's something that perhaps we should look at. The other point that I wanted to again touch upon with you is the perennial issue about the border.
Yes.
And I think this is something which perennially sort of hangs over the relationship. How do we take the India-China relationship forward if we still have the border issue and we still have the kind of incidents that you mentioned? In the context of this visit and the future of India-China relations, should we remain focused on essentially confidence building measures, keeping the peace on the border, or do you think that really a very major effort needs to be made to actually come to some kind of a deal?
Yeah.
The problem, as I see it, is that not that having a deal is not better than not having a deal, but the issue is what kind of spectrum in which you can find some kind of a compromise. That really is the key issue. I mean, are you willing to give up Tawang, for example, which the Chinese say is indispensable to any kind of border agreement? Do we accept that there could be something more than minor adjustments in the eastern sector? Because as you know, the Chinese have been saying for some time now that there have to be meaningful adjustments on the eastern sector. So what is your sense? I mean, are we close to a point where maybe there is some people say there is a window of opportunity for us to move forward on this? Or do you believe that frankly we should not be running after this kind of a chimera and we should really accept that maybe given the kind of political environment that we have, the difference in the capabilities that we have between the two sides, this is probably not the time when a settlement which is acceptable to the Indian side is likely to happen.
Yes.
Is that something?
So I'm quite strongly of the view that making a push for settlement of the boundary is a good thing. Okay. For the simple reason that, we have not had a government which is politically quite as strong in about 25 years this time. The last time, when you recall, when Rajiv Gandhi was there, he at least sort of took one major step of actually going to China. Nobody since Jawaharlal Nehru in 1954, no Indian Prime Minister had gone to China. And for Rajiv Gandhi, that was a huge bridge to sort of span. He went there and in a sense, opened up the relationship in certain ways. So to that extent, I think politically today, this government is much better placed than any of its predecessors in about 2 decades plus to actually try and push for a settlement. Of course, the fact remains that, any settlement or even an agreement to sort of give it priority in terms of negotiation also depends on whether the Chinese are interested or not. My own reading is that on the Indian side, we have for very long time used the Chinese unwillingness to settle as an alibi for ourselves never getting the political act together. And, I think there have been many opportunities. I mean, you are aware of it in the early 80s when Deng Xiaoping was there. There were times when Indians have not been so. So in a sense, I would say that if this is a very good opportunity for the Prime Minister to actually sort of ascertain for himself whether he believes that the Chinese leadership is genuinely interesting or not. If you look at what Premier Li Keqiang gave an interview to the India Today, where he said that yes, the boundary issue is something that we think we should be settled sooner rather than later. And I think the 2005 agreement, which you were quite instrumental in drafting at that point of time, still remains a very good starting point for us, because it defines the parameters within which the two sides can make concessions, which is to say that populated areas are off the table. Beyond populated areas, but still south of the McMahon line, so to speak, there are possibilities for negotiation that we should be willing to explore. But when I say that we have to give it a push, I'm not for one suggesting that any of this is going to be easy or that it can be done. But the fact still remains that we need a government which can make the case for why a boundary settlement with China is good. Because I think once you settle the boundary with China, a lot of things are going to open up for you, especially on things like economic issues and so on. Because at this point of time, it is a huge albatross that is not going to make India-China relations sort of necessarily non-competitive. I mean, that competitive edge will be there because there are so many other dimensions to it. But getting the boundary issue at least on priority to be settled is, I think, something that the government should consider seriously. Now, are the Chinese open to it? My own reading is that today they may not be. For the simple reason that, as you said, on the one hand, the Chinese have been taking this view that on most boundary issues, not just on the land border, but maritime border, they will sort of only settle on their terms. There's a sort of maximalism which is coming back to the table. The second thing is that the boundary issue is very closely linked to the question of Tibet. And about 4 weeks ago, the Chinese once again gave a statement saying that the third way of the Dalai Lama, etc., is not acceptable, which means that their position on Tibet has not changed. And that again means that, there is a certain degree of rigidity that we will face on this question. Despite all of this, I think the government should try and convince the Chinese that we need to put our weight behind this. For the simple reason that, so long as we keep that as a strategic objective, I think it will take off a lot of heat from issues like, what is happening on the border. There will be a greater willingness to explore more creative solutions to how to manage these kinds of problems. And above all, I think with this government, we actually have the political sort of, backing to allow them to do it.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you have made a good case for at least pursuing this line of thinking. Before I open the floor to questions from our audience, would you like to say a few words about this One Belt, One Road? What is, in your view, is this something that we should be looking at as an opportunity? Or here also you would recommend a more granular approach? We look at which components we can leverage to our advantage, but stay out of some other components. And if we have to do that, what is the way in which we can make this happen? I mean, are there some criteria that we should be using? What is the benchmark to use in this respect?
Frankly, I have not way up to getting access to some of the markets where they were not having that kind of access earlier. Now, if I were to look at it, take a slightly longer term view, in some sense this is also a way in which if the strategy succeeds, the relative importance of India as a market and an opportunity will also reduce in the context of the way China looks at it.
Okay.
So, in our view, in my view, our approach to this is it's still very early days in terms of what they are planning to do. They have a number of challenges to address in getting this anywhere towards implementation and reality. And we should stay focused on some of the granular market access issues that we need to address and get in this bilateral economic relationship.
Okay.
So I think we need to just, you're fully aware of the fact that we have never been able to get this kind of access. In my view, the time has never been more opportune to try and push for this. And I think if we are able to get one or two of these small successes, it's a huge beginning in this whole bilateral economic relationship.
So let us explore this a little further, try to find out a little more what this really means, and see if there are some specific areas where we can. So that's perhaps a very wise recommendation to make. We have about 20 minutes now, and we can perhaps take a few questions. Please make your question very brief. Please identify yourself and any organization that you represent, and you please also indicate which is the person, which panelist you would like to answer your question. So, yeah.
My questions addressed both to Srinath and to Shyam. What I want to know is that we understand the centrality of the border issue to India. Now, how do you convince China, how do you bring them to the table? What do you think we should do to make that happen? I mean, you are saying that Tibet is central to their understanding of the Tawang issue, for instance. Now, how do we encourage the Tibetan government? Do we reassure China that, that we will deliver the Dalai Lama to him? How do we do that? Or do we take a more assertive posture?
I'll maybe just the one part of that question. I mean, it's not that you are not negotiating with China on the border. I mean, what's the special representative talks all about? I mean, you are actually engaged in negotiations. It's another matter that those negotiations have not made much progress beyond some very valuable confidence building measures. And despite the fact that some people have perhaps not understood the significance of the political parameters and guiding principles, I certainly believe that that's a very important and very critical document, favorable to us in terms of whenever we get down to the nuts and bolts of resolving the border issue. So it's not so much that we are not really engaged in these negotiations, but as I said, how do you align the interests of one side with the other? And is it possible to have a meeting ground where what is acceptable to the Chinese side more or less corresponds to what the Indian side wants? Because unless there is that alignment, how do you get a deal? You know, I think the problem has been that we have not been able so far, my sense is, so far we have not been able to get to that point. So this challenge will remain, but we need to continue to talk about it. As far as the issue of Tibet is concerned, I hope we never get to the point when we think about delivering the, perish the thought. I think it's in a very real sense, it is all about ourselves. It's not so much about the Dalai Lama, to my mind. How we deal with the issue of Tibet and how do we deal with the Dalai Lama has much to do with what values we hold dear. And I don't think we should ever, in terms of, some kind of a, deal, ever think in terms of, departing from those values. So there is a political aspect to it, and what we would certainly hope to see is that in China's own interest, there should be some kind of a reconciliation process between His Holiness and the Chinese. I think His Holiness himself has indicated that this is something which he would like to encourage. It's another matter that there were some signs, a couple of years ago that maybe with a new government in Beijing, there was perhaps some rethink on this issue. That's no longer the case. I mean, my view is that that's no longer the case. I mean, the white paper which was issued recently would appear to show that we have gone back to a more hardline position. But I certainly believe that it is not because it is India's interest, but I believe that it is in China's own interest that there should be that reconciliation process. The Chinese may feel that the Dalai Lama is like a perishable commodity. Once he is no longer there, automatically the Tibet issue will be resolved. Frankly, I think our troubles will begin if he is no longer on the scene. So, how do we, reconcile these issues? Beg your pardon? Well, I mean, there have been, it's not that these issues have not been talked about. I mean, whether it is in official conversations or in so-called track 2 conversations or track 1.5 conversations, a lot of these things are talked about. Ultimately, you see, it's a question of what is the political reading at the leadership level. They may be, I have come across Chinese scholars who, to some extent, agree with that assessment about, the reconciliation with Tibet. But that does not necessarily mean that this is something which is accepted at the leadership level. So I think we will have to live with this challenge and keep on trying to see how we can change that perspective within which China looks at this issue. Okay, please. I think we have
Chairman,
many more questions than we can handle.
Very quickly, I'm Neelam Sabharwal. I'm a professor at the University of Maastricht. I think the young lady raised a very pertinent concern, and the realities, as Ambassador Saran has explained, are there. But the question is, in the last few years, ever since the LSE clarification exercise came to a halt in 2001 or 2, I think, then after the preliminary exchange of maps, the whole process has just been jettisoned by the Chinese side. And the question is not, I think, intended the nitty-gritty and what will be the gives and takes and so on, but that we've given up sort of the will, I think. We've set very good principles in the 2005 agreement without going into the details, but look at the public discourse. We are just not emphasizing the importance, and I was glad in the latter presentation by Mr. Raghavan, because the first one was really representing what the Chinese position is. Obviously, they're not keen, and they just feel as long as, and what has happened is that at the public level, there is a kind of a fatigue in India which is setting in, that why just talk of the border, let's talk of these bigger, more interesting things, the Chinese opportunity. At the level of the academia and the strategic experts, set it aside and talk of opportunities. And I'm sorry, at the level of the government, it has come as tranquility. So is tranquility enough, is what I would say. It is great. I think the Rajiv Gandhi visit and subsequently, and all these agreements have given us terrific diplomatic dividends. So this is a question. It's the degree to where you're going to press your interests. Everybody knows that it's not going to be, no principles and elements are going to be decided. So one is that. Second, the economic opportunity. And again, I'm very grateful to Mr. Venkateshwaran that we have really come down to the granular detail. What are we seeing in the press today? There is such a hubris, there is such a euphoria. It's almost verging on Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai when it comes to China as an economic opportunity. Unless we get the first fundamentals sorted out, of course you need to leverage your own market, you'll need to leverage your other options, then only can you get to these huge Chinese investments that we are thinking are coming our way. Are they? And the state of economy as has just been presented, are they going to build our manufacturing capabilities or just offload their inventories? And lastly, on the one road, one belt and the tent that we are wanting to be in, let's then give them also some proposals. If they have all these connectivity ideas, will they be ready to build something through Tibet? There was a long-standing proposal of the Russians with the Chinese and us. Let's play with some of those if we are coming up with out-of-box thinking.
We can suggest some corridors, India-China corridors as well. Okay. Let me take a few more questions and then I'll come back here. I think there were some hands there. Yes, please. Anupam? Yeah, I'll come to you.
Thank you, sir. Just some inputs on the economic side. My name is Nalin Kohli. I'm the past chairman of Electronics and Software Export Council. We are finding this market access, even with Japan, very difficult because of the language issue. Our strength in IT has been mainly in the English-speaking markets. So embedded software is one thing where language doesn't hurt us so much. And the whole world is now moving towards not pure hardware, but hardware-software combinations. So I think we need to take this strategic decision with the Chinese market, where access would be much better than trying to do a IT solution. Okay. But sir, in the backyard thing, instead of making roads and instead of doing ports and infrastructure, which is not our strength, we should really build on IT, which is our strength, which we have not been doing. I think that's something which we need to very quickly do.
So why don't you formulate a strategy and tell us?
We've done that. I'll share it with you.
Okay.
So the last point, just a small point. We feel in India, the trading community, which has really helped the Chinese, it is not the Indian industry. It is the traders who do this big trade with China. It's so heavily under-invoiced that your duty will not matter. What will matter is the BIS thing which you mentioned at the end. And I think that's where you need to build on.
Okay. I think we have had comments. I would like to have some questions for a change. Yeah, Anupam.
I have two half questions. One for you and Srinath. Number one, it's related to the others. What explains Chinese recalcitrance? We have heard 3 or perhaps 4 such for the border, recalcitrance to discuss the border, resolve it. One is perhaps Tibet. The other is to keep us vulnerable or on our edge. The third one is perhaps the fact that they don't think we can deliver on that, or fourth, something else. So have we actually analyzed what drives it? On the economic side, the other half question, I'm not quite I do not understand either the logic or the empirical basis for the other presentation, because all you're saying is what happened between India and China is that the Indian currency depreciated by significantly, which changed the competitiveness. What else has changed to make the big difference? And I don't believe we can deal with the economy of the size of China with a cottage industry approach, where 3 billion you're talking about. So we do need a strategy, and has anybody done any work on that, of a strategy for trading with China? I know that the Chinese have done it the other way.
Okay. Yeah, all right. And I'll come here now. Yeah, please. Short question, please.
Yeah, very short question. Anmol from Yes Bank. My question is about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that China has recently formulated, and some of the NATO members have also joined, and India is also a founding member. So do you think that as a bank which will probably act as a formidable bank against the IMF and the World Bank and give sort of funding to countries which do not really believe in the values that, say, a World Bank or an IMF actually believes in when it funds some of those projects?
Okay. Yeah, and then I'll come. So this was about AIIB. Okay.
Edmund Downey with Yale University. I wanted to ask you, Ambassador Saran, about Indian leverage in Myanmar. You had mentioned that you felt you were very confident about India's leverage in Myanmar. One conventional view is that China's Myanmar's largest trading partner has built most of the infrastructure in northern Myanmar and has vassal states more or less among rebels in northern Myanmar. So given that backdrop, what gives India that leverage over Myanmar versus China that gives you confidence here?
Yeah, okay. You wanted to speak, yeah.
I'm Karni Singh from ACC. This is again coming back to your suggestion that there are large diffused assets that India has in Myanmar, Nepal, and many other countries. But somehow there's no possible suggestion was there's no aggregating of this thing or no proper, there's no ownership of these assets, so you can't possibly leverage it. But who will leverage it?
The delivery capability.
Yeah, but still,
your ability to leverage this depends.
But who will leverage it? Who should have this ability? Is it this?
We have to
no, but the state doesn't own many of these assets, and somehow they've never done it so far. Even like, for instance, the market size of India, somehow it was not even known till almost 50,000 megawatt capacity was ordered on China. It all came in. State didn't want it, yet it happened, and. So, I mean, there was, even within the group, people could not aggregate it for some times. I don't know.
Okay. Yes, please. You want to speak? Okay.
I am Manish Agarwal. I am a development professional. I want to ask that, is there an Indian intelligence failure, like China has developed roads and railways and waterways across the border, across the LAC, while India has not done so, and it is now realizing it. Okay. And secondly, like Sino-Pak relations are a reality, and China-Sri Lanka and China-Nepal relations are growing very fast. And just the other day, Times of India has said that earthquake, China is doing a lot of work, India is doing a lot of work, but India is seeking publicity while China is not seeking publicity for it. And thirdly, on the border issue, that is there going to be a barter, like India is going to get back, China is going to return Aksai Chin on the western sector, and India is going to surrender Tawang in Arunachal Pradesh.
Okay.
On the eastern sector, in the eastern sector.
All right. Yes, please.
There were recently reports in the media which said that intelligence agencies here are skeptical about the idea of like e-visas being issued to Chinese nationals. So my question is, how does India balance this whole economic opportunities versus security concerns with regard to China?
Okay, two more questions. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Vijay. I come from an energy sector. My question is, in view of the PM's visit to China and the likelihood of an FTA, what do you think would be, if there is a likelihood of an FTA, what could be implication for India, given that they have gotten a big edge in the manufacturing sector as well as the tariff rates also? And always we have seen that we have so many products which is being dumped from China to India. So what would be the implications, both from comparative and competitive advantages? And as the ambassador said, that you have micro and macro both issues, not just macro issues on comparative side, but the micro issues.
Okay, I think we are really running out of time. Yeah, please, last question.
I just wanted to mention this one bridge, one road. what are the environmental or climate implications of it? Because Chinese, this construction binge through the Himalayas, what will be the long-term consequences of it? Because these earthquakes in Nepal, they are indicating that whatever the scientists forecast or worried about, warned against, is coming out to be true. And the whole Himalayan countryside is not like an ordinary place where they can build roads and build tunnels to the mountains. It's not like Europe or America. So this whole idea of Chinese bringing in this kind of a thing, why is no concern voiced against it? And there's a deceptive thing. When you talk about old Silk Road, it was man qua nature. It was one man walking, or the caravans going without any energy-intensive machinery. But today, if Chinese come there, they will bring saws, all kinds of earth movers in the mountain. And the consequences will be borne by all of us who are living in Himalayan, this thing. So why is there no concern? We are just completely sold over by this one bridge, one road, and talking about the economic advantages. But what about the environmental consequences?
Okay, important point. So in the next 5 minutes, we have to respond. So Srinath, will you please take some of the issues and whatever you are able to...
So on the border question, right, why is China not interested? I think you need to look at it in perspective. China had land border disputes with 16 countries since 1949. There are only 2 outstanding disputes, Bhutan and India, because India controls the Bhutanese dispute, right? So it's not as if, a good way of asking that question is, why is India not able to solve the border with China as well, right? It's not just the Chinese are not doing it. So it's not as if the Chinese are the only ones who are on the driver's seat saying that, when they will decide. There have been a lot of times in our history when we have not taken up opportunities for settlement. Today, however, the reality is that the border issue is also linked considerably to a certain kinds of nationalist sentiment within China. If you look at what happened when the Prime Minister signed on to the Chinese microblogs and stuff, people said return South Tibet and so on. All of that is a reality. That the Chinese government will have to factor in as well, right? So which is why my point was that, you need a political agreement on both sides that they will give priority to this issue. Settlement is in the future, but we have to agree that this is important. And, there was a very interesting article yesterday by our former national security advisor, who's also the special representative, where he said that, the boundary negotiations are at a point where we need political will, which is absolutely true. Factually, that is very correct. And I feel that, we are, at least in India, have a government which is currently pretty strong. And I think this is one area where it could invest a degree of political capital. Not doing it would be another wasted opportunity. Whether the Chinese respond or not, let's try it. Yeah, why adopt this highly conservative position that the Chinese are never going to settle it, so we should do nothing, right? That is where I think we've missed out on so many opportunities in the past. And the sooner we recognize it, the better. In terms of, what is the kind of barter, etc., right? See, frankly, the outlines of the solutions have been known to negotiators for a very, very long time, right? The only question is, I don't think anyone in India is expecting to get all of oxygen back. That's been with China for the last 60 years, now come back to you, right? But there are certain things along the line of actual control that we want, which are in our negotiating position, it's quite clear, right? So I think the broad outlines of what is possible is known. And again, I'll reinforce what Ambassador Saran said. The 2005 agreement is still, in my opinion, the key to sort of go back. And if we can hold the Chinese to that agreement and start the negotiations with a degree of political backing at the highest level, then maybe we can make some progress in the years ahead. And even if we do not, the mere fact that we accord priority to this issue will, I think, take the heat of the boundary in a way that it does not. I'll also want to sort of respond to this issue on e-visas. The Indian intelligence agencies have not just been sort of, stopping e-visas for Chinese. For a very long time, Chinese academics are finding it very difficult to come to India. In places like my institution, to invite, Chinese academics colleagues to come and share their experience and knowledge with us. We've had enormous amount of hoops to jump through. And frankly, that is not about this government or the previous government. It's about the agencies and the institution, the state, right? Which I think have their view. Their view should be taken on board, but we need to take a political call on these things, which we have never done, right? Instead of that, political judgment has been surrendered to what is seen as the expert view of one particular agency, which is, of course, looking at things from their point of view, right? If you ask a cop what is the most important thing, he'll tell you security is the most important thing, right? But that cannot be the basis on which you deal with a big country like China. And on this issue, I must say that, we've had so many problems in the past that it's actually shameful.
Well,
particularly what Anupam raised, perhaps if you could...
Yeah, if I may just, that was the one pertinent point that I wanted to reiterate. So it's not just the currency which has changed. When a couple of other things which have changed are the significantly higher labor cost growth rate of China compared to India. So in many parts, that has been almost more than doubling since 2009 to now, and relative to that, the pace at which the Indian costs have grown have changed. Certain areas where there were subsidies available on power have been withdrawn by China, so therefore some of the economic advantage which happened due to that has again been removed. Some of the regulations which were driving, if I were to call it, there was an export tax on some of the commodities which were preventing exports from happening from China are now allowed to happen. So there have been a far few more changes and not just the currency issue which has changed the competitive dimension between India and China. So, so in that context, what you will see going forward is, in my view, an acceleration of some of these elements and therefore a rethinking of the way we want to economically engage with China will need to happen in this relationship.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just try to respond to 2 or 3 issues that have been raised. One is the issue of Myanmar, and how have things evolved there. Just by my own experience, there was a period where India was not present there, in a sense, because of our opposition to the military regime, our very obvious support and sympathy for Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League of Democracy. This is what I meant by saying, when you create space, somebody will occupy it. Because if you are not there, then why should you be surprised that somebody else establishes a strong presence? And that is what China did over the, starting from, say, the middle 80s, but particularly after 1989, when the Tiananmen incident took place in China, and then after that you had, where the Aung San Suu Kyi was arrested, and a lot of people were killed in those demonstrations. That was a period where actually they came together very, very, very strongly, because they both felt, in a sense, isolated, and we were part of the opposition, in a sense. Now, the judgment call for us was, do we continue with this? Is it our judgment that perhaps this regime is not going to be able to consolidate itself and is going to be overthrown, and perhaps the NLD will come in? Very soon it became obvious that this had more endurance than perhaps we had thought was possible. So therefore, we did make a shift, which required also that you had to compromise, in a sense, with a very absolutist view of, political legitimacy, human rights, various other issues, which normally we would take as being very important in terms of our relationship with any country. When we decided to try and explore the possibility of at least establishing a degree of a countervailing presence in Myanmar, we actually found that the generals and the people whom we spoke to were very uncomfortable with this kind of a dependence, heavy dependence upon China. They were looking for some options. Every country wants to have a degree of room for, even the smallest country wants to have a room for maneuver. It wants to have some options. Are you ready to respond to that? And what did we do? Over a certain period of time, we did begin to respond to that. And yes, we are certainly not as important a player in Myanmar today as China is, despite some of the difficulties which have arisen between China and Myanmar. But I think it would be fair to say that despite some of the problems we have, again, with delivery, which I mentioned, we have a decent enough presence in Myanmar. In terms of some of the major concerns that we have had with respect to, the Bay of Bengal, the issue of, some of the sensitivity which we have along the land border with Myanmar. It would be fair to say that because of our reaching out to Myanmar and establishing a reasonably positive relationship, some of these concerns we have been able to manage. So that's, to me, that's a gain. So if we are looking at some of the other neighbors, it's not the same thing in every case, but I still believe that we have the means to leverage some of the assets that we have in these countries, not assets in terms of, intelligence assets or things like that, but assets in terms of, with Bhutan, for example. One of the great success stories is what we have been able to do together with Bhutan, say with the development of hydroelectric power resources. That has been a win-win for both countries. Today, Bhutan is one of the richest countries in South Asia. Even with Nepal, I would say that if you look at the political trajectory, I know people are very frustrated with the lack of progress on the constitution making, and that they have not really been able to get their act together. How many times do our political parties get their act together? You have to accept that when you have a democracy, it will not necessarily go in the direction or according to the script somebody else is laying down. So it's a question of also having a certain degree of confidence, looking at in a somewhat larger perspective, having served in Nepal when the insurgency was at its heights. I would say for the people of Nepal to have a situation where at least the kind of violence which was taking place is no longer there. People are not caught in the crossfire between the Royal Nepal Army on the one side and the Maoist guerrillas on the other side. I think it's a big gain. So we should not sneeze at that. And India played an important role in bringing about that change. That's important. Vulnerability of India in the neighborhood. How do we, it is the vulnerability, China is not making us vulnerable. It is we who will make ourselves vulnerable. I think that's something that we have to understand. Again, it is a variation of what I have been talking about. That the vulnerability that we sometimes feel is because we have not got our act together, not because China has done a better job. So it is in terms of dealing with the neighborhood, it's extremely important that the focus first and foremost must be how do we manage our neighborhood? What do we do in terms of leveraging the very obvious advantages we have in each one of our neighboring countries? Not in terms of having a dominating presence, not in terms of making sure that we lay down the law, but looking at a relationship which has so many facets. You have the economic facet, you have the political facet, but can China equal the kind of people-to-people linkages, the cultural affinities that we share, for example, with Nepal? No. But if you have not been able to leverage it, don't blame the Chinese. Blame yourself. So I think in terms of dealing with what is a very real challenge and is probably going to become a bigger challenge, much of what needs to be done is here, inside our own country, and in terms of fashioning strategies which really identify what are the assets that we have, what are the liabilities we have. I mean, it's like what a businessman would do. I mean, what are my asset side, what are my liability side, how do I neutralize the liability side, how do I build up on my assets? And if you do that exercise, you would probably, I think we undersell ourselves. We probably have far more going for us than we think we have. On that note, thank you very much for being here this evening. I think we had a very productive conversation. I would like to thank my co-panelists who have not only been, have made very, very thought-provoking presentations, but have also been very patient with all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.